2004, as well as being a leap year, which even in my 30s, I'll admit I don't fully understand, had many Game of the Year contenders across pretty much every platform. PlayStation 2 had some great games like GTA San Andreas, Gran Turismo 4, and Killzone. Xbox had the blockbuster Halo 2, Fable, and Ninja Gaiden. PC got Half-Life 2, Doom 3, and Far Cry. And even the GameCube got Pikmin 2. My point is that there were no shortage of absolute bangers in 2004 across pretty much all of the mainstream genres. And because of this, it made it really easy for some otherwise remarkably fun games to fly under the radar. Speaking of flying, in 2004, developer People Can Fly released their first title, simply named Painkiller, published by the now defunct Dreamcatcher Interactive, and initially released for the PC, and then several years later released for the Xbox, repackaged with some tweaks and its first expansion, Battle Out of Hell, included. While a port of Painkiller was announced for the PlayStation 2 and PlayStation Portable, it was subsequently cancelled, necessitating a 9-year wait for the remake of Painkiller, Hell and Damnation, to make its way to the Sony PlayStation 3. But the lack of support for Sony's console didn't stop Painkiller from being a success, with many gaming publications awarding the title a favourable review. GameSpy, Computer Games Magazine, and PC Zone all gave Painkiller their respective Editor's Choice Award, while IGN, ironically the only one of these still in business at the time of publishing this video, praised the game's visual flair but criticised the soundtrack and questioned the game's overall simplicity. Clearly the developers knew they were onto a good thing though, because later that same year in 2004, we got the first expansion pack, Battle Out of Hell, again released to generally favourable reviews. But the developers weren't done there. In 2007, we got Painkiller Overdose. In 2009, Painkiller Resurrection. 2011 saw Painkiller Redemption. And 2012 saw Recurring Evil and the effective remake of the first game, Hell and Damnation. These games released to mixed reviews, with many publications arguing that the game's formula, while enjoyable, was beginning to show its age. It really was quite the FPS franchise in the 2000s, only really rivaled by Activision's Call of Duty at the time. Like all good games of the 2000s, Painkiller offered a PC demo, including 3 levels and 3 of the 5 weapons from the full game. This was actually my first taste of Painkiller before I picked it up several years later as a budget re-release. As I said earlier, there were some real bangers in 2004, and teenage AZ Ash's job could only put so many games on the table every year. Thankfully, unlike some other Heritage releases, Painkiller isn't lost to licensing purgatory, and at the time of publishing this video, is available on Good Old Games as the modernised Painkiller Black Edition, which includes the base game and the Battle Out of Hell expansion, basically what you got in the original Xbox version. There was a multiplayer mode available for Painkiller, but given official support for this ended many years ago, and it never really made the cult classic impact of Unreal Tournament, Counter-Strike, and other titles like that, I'll leave that topic where it belongs, in the past. Before we continue, a massive thank you to everyone who supports the channel. If you enjoy this content, please do consider subscribing. It doesn't cost you anything, but it does support the channel. With that out of the way, let's grab some souls, pick up a wooden stake, and head back to 2004 to remember Painkiller. Gameplay-wise, Painkiller is a first-person shooter, but it doesn't always feel like a first-person shooter. I mean, yeah, it feels like a first-person shooter because you are literally in the first-person perspective and you're shooting things, but the feeling you get from playing Painkiller doesn't necessarily follow the generally accepted standards that previous first-person shooter titles have delivered. Generally, in a first-person shooter of this era, you have a storyline which serves to drive a narrative process forward. Objectives such as activate a switch to lower a bridge, solve a puzzle to open a door, which serve as a means to drive that narrative forward, and exploration and combat to tie it all together. Now, when games do a great job of bringing these 4 pillars together, combined with the appropriate pacing, the game feels fun, it feels satisfying, enjoyable, you're going to have a good time, etc, etc. When games don't do a great job of bringing these together, they can feel boring and lacking engagement because they don't generally do a very good job of emotionally investing the player in the conclusion. Why do I care to see the end of something if I have no emotional investment in it? Simple, I don't. I've been spending the last few weeks playing Painkiller and trying to work out what type of game it actually feels like. And at the risk of you all coming after me with torches and pitchforks, it really feels like a tower defense game, but more on that later. Painkiller has a story, but it's not a particularly exciting or inspired one. In fact, I had to use Google to remind me of some of the plot points when recording this. Never a good sign. So the story puts you in the boots of a guy called Daniel Gardner, who at the beginning of the game decides to drive his wife Catherine at great speed in the pouring rain to dinner for her birthday. You don't have to be some type of prophet to know that this doesn't end well, and yeah, both Daniel and Catherine end up dead. Now, while Catherine ends up in heaven, Daniel ends up trapped in purgatory, effectively a place of existence between hell and heaven. One day, an angel appears to Daniel and basically tells him that Lucifer, which is basically the devil, is planning to invade heaven and has already started by invading purgatory. He offers you a deal. Help save heaven and you'll be reunited with Catherine, which you obviously accept, and so starts the first level of the game. I'll be honest here, there's not much in the way of a story. It serves a very loose purpose of advancing the gameplay, but it's entirely forgettable. It feels like the developers built the game with lots of cool locales and enemies, and then afterwards came up with a story to tie it all together. But like you don't go to an Italian restaurant to order a curry, you don't play Painkiller for its story. Now the core gameplay loop revolves around a very simple process. You enter an area, the area seals, enemies continue to spawn and rush to kill you, you kill them all, the area unseals and you progress. That's it. That's Painkiller.
That's it? That's it?
Sounds like a lot of the flow of a tower defense game, doesn't it? Now, this would get boring very quickly if it didn't deliver a very solid moment-to-moment gunplay experience, which I'm thrilled to say it does. Painkiller is a fast game that puts its number one focus on mowing down Lucifer's army to progress through the game. Hell, no pun intended, there isn't even a reload mechanic in the game, and I like this because the developers knew that if you had to reload, it'd take you out of the most fun component the game offers, the combat. While there is a great variety of enemies in the game, they basically fall into two categories. Those that rush you with a melee attack, which you can't outrun, so you basically end up circle strafing to dispatch them one by one, and those with a ranged attack that will often circle strafe you, shooting projectiles at you. The trick is, to dispatch the ranged opponents, you need to generally slow down, which gives the melee enemies time to catch up to you. And believe me, if you get cornered by a group of melee enemies, you may as well go ahead and hit that quick load button right away, because unless you're stocked up on health and armor, you'll come off about as good as a kebab left out overnight. You would think that in a fairly formulaic game like Painkiller, the pacing would be difficult to master, but the game actually does a really good job here, with the difficulty level slowly ramping up as you progress through the game's 5 chapters. A good example of this early on is you encounter a Grim Reaper-like enemy, which rushes at you with a sickle, which is fairly easy to dispatch. But then a little later in the level, this same enemy now starts throwing this sickle at you as well. So now you need to be aware of both the melee risk as well as the ranged risk of this enemy type. This is excellent pacing and delivers a nice degree of foreshadowing by showing you the melee-only enemy before switching it up with the ranged enemy. While I died several times in my playthrough of Painkiller, barring an isolated area in the middle of the game which just floods the room with tanks and no health, it never felt unfair. If I died, it was because I had not dealt with enemies quick enough, or I had not prioritized my targets well enough. Painkiller respects its systems and builds trust with the player, which is key to creating an enjoyable gameplay experience. Speaking of trust though, there is an opponent in the game which defies all known mechanics and trust, and actually goes on to become the most deadly adversary in the entire game. And that's the humble barrel. That's right folks, the game's most deadly adversary is an unmarked wooden barrel. Try and break it open and it explodes with concussive force, taking away a chunk of your health. Heck, even the enemies which run towards you with explosive barrels, which in itself is a cheap mechanic, have their barrels labelled. But this is not the case with every other unmarked barrel in the game, which will explode when destroyed. I was very confused with what had actually killed me the first time this happened. Now, it isn't all bad news. Once you work out that these barrels can pulverize you, you'll learn that you can adapt them to be used on your enemies, although your enemies can also use them on you, so it's not all beer and Skittles for sure. But don't worry, barrels aren't the only thing that you'll have to take on the Hordes of Hell. The game offers 5 weapons, but each of them have a vastly different secondary fire, so it really feels more like 10 weapons, and barring perhaps one weapon in the shotgun, all of the secondary fires are pretty much completely unrelated to the primary fire, which makes me question why the developers just didn't make a lot of these separate weapons. Alas, it does offer some interesting mechanics mixing these together. The first weapon is the Painkiller. That's right, the title of the game is based on the first weapon you receive in-game. The Painkiller's primary attack is spinning its blades like a giant mince meat machine, basically mincing anyone that gets in your way. The only time I legitimately found this useful was when I was very low on ammo and wanted to conserve my ammo for higher level enemies. You can still very easily be overwhelmed by a mob of enemies using this. The secondary fire is basically a light beam weapon.
We call it a laser.
Which shoots the end of the weapon out and forms a beam which damages anything that it touches. There's also the ability to combine both of these and effectively shoot out the blade while it's spinning. Again, like the primary fire though, this is a last resort weapon, not something you're going to be pushing through the campaign with. Next up is a staple of the FPS genre, the shotgun. The shotgun is borderline overpowered in the first few levels of the game, but delivers a satisfying punch to knock down most enemies with one shot early on. It's still incredibly useful later on in the game, as its secondary fire freezes pretty much every non-boss enemy, allowing you to shatter them with one shot from the primary fire. Yeah, very useful stuff. Then we have one of the coolest weapons in any first-person shooter I've ever played, the stake gun. No, not that stake. The stake gun shoots a wooden stake on a dipping trajectory, this is important for aiming, to literally nail your enemies to a wall, well, lower level enemies at least. It's a lot of fun to use early in the game, but as the game progresses and mobility becomes more important, it becomes a lot more difficult to line up your shots, which is where the secondary fire, a grenade launcher, comes in useful. Shoot a grenade out, after a few seconds, it explodes, doing AoE damage. Nice. I've said it before and I'll say it again, every FPS by law needs to have a rocket launcher, so of course Painkiller abides by this. Later on in the game, this is going to be your bread and butter, and thankfully you're given a reasonable amount of ammo to use it. The rocket launcher's secondary fire is a minigun, which has an insane rate of fire, but burns through ammo equally fast, so you're definitely going to need to pick and choose where you'll be using this combination. The last weapon of Painkiller is the Electro Driver. You're getting some sort of shinobi-inspired shuriken launcher as a primary fire, which thankfully holds a straight line, making it really effective for longer range enemies, and some type of Tesla-inspired lightning bolt shooter as the secondary fire. The primary fire is definitely more useful here, given the time to kill is just way too long with the lightning bolts. Now, the other offensive or defensive system, depending on your point of view, is the tarot card system, which, while not technically required to complete the game, can definitely make some of the game segments a lot easier. To cut a long story short, completing certain tasks in every level, such as killing all monsters or completing a level within a certain time period, will award either a gold or silver tarot card. Silver tarot cards offer a level-wide buff, for example, starting the level with increased ammo or increasing your base health for the level, whereas the gold cards offer a one-off 30-second buff per level, which might include things like moving faster or dealing double damage. The tarot card system kind of reminds me of the GoldenEye cheat system a bit, or a bit of a discount achievement system, not essential to the experience, but a nice way to extend the replay value. Painkiller's level design is clearly inspired by a Gothic theme, though it includes many horror-based elements in its locales also. Each chapter in the game, of which there are 5, help to progress the narrative through the level design, which in a game that's fairly light on story content is an important detail. For example, in Chapter 1, the game starts in a cemetery, which you fight your way through to an atrium area, Once you're in the atrium area, you find a lift which takes you down to some catacombs, and as you work your way through the catacombs, you emerge in a cathedral, and so on. In the course of Painkiller's roughly 12-hour quest, you'll visit many locations from prisons to castles, swamps to airbases, and of course my favourite level, the Asylum. Now I didn't realise it at the time, but the Asylum is actually modelled off the real-world Danvers State Hospital, which was thankfully, if the reports are correct, closed down in 1992. But it goes to show the level of the care the developers put into using the level design to help create the Painkiller universe. It would have been easier to create a design from fiction, but using something real-world required more investment, and the payoff certainly exists because the place definitely feels like an asylum. Without ruining the experience for new players, you basically start outside on a stormy night in front of the asylum and have to work out how to get inside and work through its 4 levels, with each one getting weirder and more terrifying than the last. If I had to equate this segment to a modern game, it would probably be the house of Resident Evil 7, and that's high praise coming from me. Many of Painkiller's levels feature very large, expansive open areas for combat, and this is frankly where the Painkiller experience shines. Using their proprietary pain engine, the developers were able to put an impressive amount of enemies on screen while retaining a richly detailed world, all with fairly modest recommended system requirements for 2004. But it wasn't just the chapter levels which were a technical marvel. The boss fights, of which there are several in the game, feature giant arenas with even larger bosses. I'm pretty sure the boss size relative to the character was the largest I've seen in 2004, and thinking about it today, I can't think of a first-person shooter with larger bosses than Painkiller. They are just ridiculously large and quite the spectacle. If you ask me if a game has good sound design, I'll generally think back to the game, and if I can remember the soundtrack, then it's generally something that was done well. If I can't remember it, then I probably didn't think it was overly memorable. Painkiller lands somewhat smack bang in the middle of this spectrum. Before my recent playthrough, I could have told you that it included a mixture of rock and synth soundtracks during combat, but I couldn't hum out any of those beats. This contrasts with something like Unreal Tournament, whose menu music is laser etched into my mind. Painkiller's soundtrack is a lot like leftover Chinese food. Is it the best it could be? No. Are you still going to enjoy it? Yes. All of the voice actors turn in good performances in the game's cutscenes, with each actor sounding unique and invested in delivering their lines. Likewise, all of the sound effects are remarkably solid. Enemies all have their own unique sounds, with some sounding extremely disturbing. Asylum level, I'm looking at you here. As well as a good ambient noise soundtrack throughout the non-combat focused area of the levels. Overall, Painkiller sticks the landing with sound design. What's here is solid and well suited to the greater narrative. Painkiller was never going to win Game of the Year. Appeal wasn't the problem, rather stiff competition. From developers releasing sequels to some of the most recognisable franchises in 2004. It never stood a chance.
That happened, and we all let it happen.
But that doesn't make Painkiller a bad game. Painkiller is a fun title, which took some great elements from older games and evolved them into what we know now as the Painkiller formula, carving out its own unique game style, which I call the Tower Defense FPS. Today, the original developer, People Can Fly, still exists, with their most recent title, at the time of recording this video, Outriders, which generally received favourable reviews. Although the Painkiller franchise effectively ended in 2012 with Painkiller Hell and Damnation, it's hard to believe that more modern games like 2016's Doom reboot didn't take at least some inspiration from the formula which made Painkiller a success. But that's enough from me. Do you agree or disagree with my opinions? Let me know down in the comments. And as always, thanks for watching.